All right, so let's jump right in. We're taking a deep dive into all the recent changes in immigration policy since Trump got back in the White House. We've been looking at a bunch of articles from the Associated Press, and they cover a lot of ground, federal actions, state legislation, even some new appointments.
It's really interesting to see how this isn't just coming from Washington.
Yeah,
You know, it seems like a ton of states are getting in on this, almost like they're all trying to see who can be the toughest on immigration.
exactly. But before we get into all that, let's talk about what Trump himself is doing.
Yeah.
He wasted no time. I mean, right away, he signs this bill. It's actually named after a murder victim and requires detention for immigrants who are accused of crimes.
Hmm.
And we're not just talking about violent crimes either.
Oh, wow.
Even something like theft could get you detained.
That's a big change. And it kind of makes you think about, due process and all that. These people haven't even been convicted yet.
Right.
It's just an accusation at this point, and they're being held. It's a pretty big shift from how our justice system usually handles these things.
For sure. And then on top of that, there's his choice for Homeland Security, Kristi Noem,
Oh, yeah, her.
the governor of South Dakota. Who would have guessed that?
I know, right?
I mean, she's known for being tough on immigration, but her background is mostly agriculture.
Right, like rural policy and stuff.
It's not exactly the typical resume you'd expect for someone heading up Homeland Security.
It really isn't, but that's what makes it so interesting. It's like Trump's looking for someone who can bring a different perspective to the job, Maybe someone who can use those experiences in a way we haven't seen before. Like imagine her focusing on securing the food supply chain or really tightening border control in rural areas. It's definitely a new approach.
Or confirmation hearing was definitely a big deal.
Oh.
She talked about cracking down on illegal immigration, deporting anyone with a criminal record or a final deportation order. And she even hinted at bringing back some pretty controversial policies like remain in Mexico.
You mean the one that forces asylum seekers to stay in Mexico while they wait for their cases to be heard in U.S. courts? That's a big one, and it's still being challenged in court, so its legality is kind of up in the air.
Right. And she didn't shy away from other hot-button issues either. She mentioned overhauling FEMA and disaster relief.
Yeah.
She wants to make sure aid gets to everyone who needs it, regardless of their political views.
Oh, yeah, she was governor, right.
Right. She had to handle some pretty serious natural disasters in South Dakota.
Yeah, I remember that. That's going to be interesting to watch because we've seen how politicized disaster relief can get.
Yeah,
Her approach could really change how communities recover from these crises.
for sure. She also talked about reforming the Secret Service.
Yeah.
Apparently, they're really short-staffed and need to get back to basics, especially after that whole assassination attempt on Trump. And then there's all the drama with CISA.
Seas.
Yeah, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency.
Oh, right.
The Republicans are going after them hard, saying they've strayed from their mission, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah, it seems like that criticism is part of a bigger debate about the government's role in fighting misinformation.
Especially during emergencies.
Right. And Noam seems to agree with those concerns, so her stance on CISA is probably going to add fuel to that fire.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got a very determined president setting the agenda, a new Homeland Security chief with a unique background and a tough stance on immigration. But what's really interesting is how all of this is affecting things at the state level.
Absolutely. We're seeing so many states jumping in to support this crackdown. It's amazing.
Yeah, they're all trying to outdo each other.
Exactly. Like Florida, for example.
Oh, yeah, Florida. Governor DeSantis just signed that massive immigration package.
Oh, no, it's huge.
Millions of dollars are going into enforcement. They're creating new crimes, specifically targeting immigrants who are here illegally.
Right. And they're even getting rid of in-state tuition for undocumented students.
It's a really sweeping package.
It is. And some of those measures are definitely going to be challenged in court. Like that whole thing about making the death penalty mandatory for immigrants convicted of capital offenses, even if they're here illegally. That raises some serious constitutional questions because it suggests different punishments based on someone's immigration status.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And Florida's not alone in this. We're seeing similar bills popping up in Alabama and Georgia.
It's definitely a trend worth watching. It shows how much the political landscape is changing and how this whole crackdown is resonating in a lot of states.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And it brings us to the whole sanctuary city issue. This is where things get really heated.
Oh, yeah. This is where we see cities pushing back against the federal government. Yeah, it's like a whole other battleground when you start talking about sanctuary cities.
It's almost like they're breaking the law.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
hiding criminals or something.
Exactly.
But it's actually way more complicated than that.
It is. It is. It's not about letting people commit crimes and get away with it.
Right.
It's more about building trust between immigrant communities and the police.
Hmm,
If someone is afraid to report a crime or even just talk to the police because they're worried about being deported,
right.
it makes everyone less safe.
Yeah, I could see that.
So the idea is that everyone should feel comfortable working with the police, regardless of their immigration status.
So it's really about prioritizing public safety.
Exactly. And that's where sanctuary policies come in. They usually limit how much local resources are used to enforce federal immigration law.
Hmm.
That way, local police can focus on protecting their own communities.
Which makes sense, but I can see how the Trump administration and people who support stricter enforcement would have a problem with this.
Oh, yeah, they definitely see it as a challenge to their authority.
Right.
Like, these cities are creating safe havens for people who shouldn't be in the country in the first place.
And that's preventing them from doing their jobs.
Right. They argue that sanctuary policies make it harder to remove people who are here illegally, which they say puts everyone at risk.
It's a tough situation. There are strong arguments on both sides.
It really is. And this debate is playing out everywhere, not just in the news, but in actual courtrooms all over the country.
Well, one case that really got my attention is the Department of Justice suing Illinois, Chicago, and Cook County over their sanctuary policies.
Oh, wow, yeah.
It's like a direct challenge. They're basically saying these policies are going against federal law.
And Chicago has been a sanctuary city for a long time.
Yeah.
So this lawsuit is a big deal. It's a direct attack on their efforts to protect immigrants.
And Mayor Johnson is definitely not backing down. He's saying that he's going to fight to keep Chicago a welcoming place for immigrants.
Good for him. This case could have a huge impact on other cities and states.
Oh, yeah. Depending on how it's decided, it could set a precedent for how the government deals with sanctuary jurisdictions all across the U.S.
It's a major legal battle, that's for sure. And it's not just the federal government that's pushing back. Some states are actually targeting local officials who resist the crackdown.
It's like they're trying to stop any opposition before it even starts.
Right. Like Wyoming, they're trying to pass a law banning sanctuary policies, even though there aren't any in the state right now.
Wow. That's pretty extreme.
It is. And then you've got places like Georgia and Louisiana making it easier to sue local governments and officials who don't follow state bans on sanctuary policies.
So it's basically do what we say or else.
Pretty much. And or else can be pretty serious. Like in Florida and Tennessee, local officials who ignore these immigration laws could face fines or even jail time.
So local leaders are caught in the middle.
Totally. They have to try and balance the needs of their communities with all this pressure from the state and federal governments. It's a really tough spot to be in.
This whole thing just seems to be making the tension between the federal government, states' rights, and local autonomy even worse.
It really does. And this isn't just about immigration policy anymore. It's about some pretty fundamental questions like who gets to decide what happens in our communities?
And who gets to define what it means to be an American?
Exactly. We can't forget about the people whose lives are directly affected by all of this.
It's easy to get caught up in the legal arguments and the politics, but at the end of the day, this is about real people facing real challenges.
Their stories often get lost in all the noise. So where do we go from here? What does this all mean for the future of immigration in America? It feels like we're at a turning point.
I agree. It seems like everything is up in the air. The legal battles, the new state laws, what the American people want.
Right? All of that is going to shape immigration policy going forward. It's a really important moment, and it makes you wonder how it's all going to play out in the next election.
Right. Will we see immigration become an even bigger issue in campaigns? Will these policies motivate people to vote?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's clear that these issues are a major part of our political landscape. The way they're handled could definitely change how people vote in the future. We've covered a lot today.
We have. But it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
Immigration is a complex issue. It's got a long and complicated history in this country.
Yeah.
We need to be willing to look at it from different angles, have open and honest conversations, and understand that there's no easy solution.
So for our listeners out there, what's the one thing you really want them to take away from all of this?
For me, it's realizing that immigration is complicated. There's no quick fix. Every decision has consequences, both good and bad. We have to think about the human impact, Find that balance between keeping people safe and treating everyone with compassion and respecting their rights.
I think that's a great point. And to everyone listening, keep learning about this, read different perspectives, and come to your own conclusions. Because the question we keep coming back to is this. In a nation built by immigrants, What does it really mean to be a sanctuary in the 21st century? It's a big question.
It is. It really makes you think about who we are as a country and what we stand for.
So before we go, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from this whole discussion?
I think the biggest takeaway is that immigration is a really complex issue.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers, no quick fixes. Everything we do has consequences, and we have to be mindful of that. We have to think about how our actions affect real people,
Yeah.
and try to find that balance between security and compassion.
Well said. And to our listeners out there, we really encourage you to keep digging into this issue. Read different perspectives, talk to people, and come to your own conclusions, because this is a conversation that affects all of us.
It really does. It's about our values as a society.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.